A book that starts off as speculative science fiction, turns into action, and then bam, surprise romance. The Kingdoms by Natasha Pulley is basically a blend of the aforementioned genres. It's primarily set in an alternate version of England, where the French won the Napoleonic Wars. So London has become Londres, King's Cross is Gare du Roi, and Cambridge is Pont de Cam, and so on and so forth. It follows a character called Joe, who turns up at Gare du Roi train station with amnesia, having no specific memory of who he was and what he had been doing up until that point. He is found by his family, a French bloke who is actually his master, and Joe's wife Alice. As in this version, the English have become slaves in the French Empire. Joe never recovers his memory properly and is diagnosed with a specific form of epilepsy, which has affected several people across England, wherein they find themselves forgetting the world and sort of remembering a false set of facts. Joe also receives a postcard near the beginning, dated from nearly 100 years ago, which features a lighthouse that has only just been built. He becomes an engineer and eventually gets the opportunity to go to the lighthouse in question, which is Eileen Moor in Scotland, when the light stops working and the keepers there mysteriously disappear. I got very excited when I heard it was going to be Eileen Moor Lighthouse because it's a real lighthouse that exists in the Flannan Isles, I think. And there was actually a group of lighthouse keepers who did go missing there, and no one to this day is quite sure what happened to them. Were they swept out to sea by a rare 200-foot wave? Were they blown away by a strong wind? Did a fight break out amongst the keepers that ended in their tragic deaths? Or did a romance lead to a murder-suicide? Were they abducted by aliens? Or did they lose a rap battle to the blue men of the Minch and end up being dragged into the ocean or turned into birds? Each theory is as likely as the next, and yet this mystery has remained unsolved. Anyway, it is a real-life mystery, which is cool, and this book does offer an explanation, although time travel is perhaps a tad unlikely. So yeah, it does start with this sort of speculative science fiction flavour with the time travel elements, which begets alternate timelines and different universes and the such. But it does quickly turn into more of an action, war and historical book when Joe ends up going back to 1807-ish, a couple of years after the Battle of Trafalgar, to stop the French from winning the war they weren't meant to win in the first place. The romance element doesn't really come in until the last quarter or so, which does make sense. You know, as much as I like romance.
We're in a war, man!
So I really, really enjoyed this book. I've mostly got positive things to say about it, so let's go into those. The writing is very good. It's got some lovely prose and some really, really fun descriptions. My favourite was when a character was described as being a bejeweled, sickly-looking mushroom man, because I found that very funny. So yeah, it's written really well. I thought the time travel stuff was handled quite well as well. That was a really bad sentence. Considering how much it delves into alternate timelines and things like that, I think it did a good job of sort of making sense without too many sort of logical leaps or whatever. Especially as those can really be the downfall of a lot of sort of science fiction time travel stories. I think it's because the focus wasn't on the time travel in this. It was treated more like a sort of soft magic system, I suppose, in a way, because the characters don't really... I mean, I suppose they do question it, but the characters don't try to explain it. There's no, like, scientists saying, oh, this is how the time travel works. It's nothing like that. It just is, and the characters aren't trying to find out how or why it works, so there's no... it doesn't fall down that department. But it also does give us some sort of foundational rules through this experiment with these tortoises. So the reader knows fairly early on that what would happen if Joe's grandparents were to accidentally be killed because of his meddlings in the past, for instance. So it kind of gets rid of any of those obvious questions early on, but it's not solid enough that you look too hard at it and it comes apart. It's quite soft, but it's done well, I think. I suppose the argument could be made that characters don't really question it or want to investigate it that much. But considering the characters who know about it are pretty much all come from a time where they're in the middle of a war, and they are using the time travel to their advantage, I don't think that's much of an issue, really. It is a bit of a mind-bending story, with all the different timelines and universes and such, and there are times where it seems like it doesn't make sense, but when you get to the end, it does, and everything wraps up in a very satisfying manner. It feels like it makes sense. Which again is a very good thing when you're dealing with time travel. This is also an historical book, because obviously it's mostly set during the Napoleonic Wars. And from what I can tell, the details do feel right. I mean, I'm not an expert in that era of history, but nothing stands out as sort of being wrong or not sounding right. And even if there were any inaccuracies, Natasha Pulley uses such an authoritative narration style that I would believe anything she says. The way death was handled was quite good. It's very brutal, but not in a gory, bloody way. Just more brutal in the sort of sheer volume of death, and this almost nonchalant attitude towards it. Like, there are a couple of battles, mostly between ships, so people are getting like blown apart by the cannonballs and the chain stuff that's used to like rip through a hull. People are burned and drowned, and the surgeons would just like shoot people in the head if they can't treat them at the time. And it's just like part of life. It's horrifying, but it did a really good job of showing the reader how brutal this world is, and how war can really affect your sort of perception of human life and loss. So I thought that was done very well. The use of language is quite interesting. It's all in English, but Pulley makes it very clear that some of the dialogue is actually in French, and then acknowledges the difference between French that would have been spoken in 1800 whatever, and then the sort of French spoken in enslaved England from the early 1900s. But I think she's just interested in language in general, because it does seem to come up in quite a few of her books. I also think the amnesia was done quite well. Amnesia is one of those things that usually feels quite cliched, like it's just used for dramatic tension, but you're kind of going, oh, well, they're going to get their memory back through the power of love or something. But in this, it felt deserved, because it is quite closely entwined with the plot and the mechanics of like the time travel in the world and stuff. Thumbs up for that. I think it's the best use of amnesia I've read in a while. And finally, there's a tiger in this, which is excellent. The tiger isn't named, unfortunately, and she doesn't eat anyone's face, which is also a shame, because there were a few characters who I would have liked to have seen their faces getting ripped off. But on the bright side, nothing horrible happens to the tiger, so any tiger lovers can read this without fear. If you're a tortoise lover, I've got some bad news. The only issues I had were more on the sort of structural side of it, the sort of putting of the story together. And I couldn't really remember a couple of instances, and they were so minor that they didn't really affect my enjoyment of the book. But it was just like, for instance, Joe received this letter, and he sort of reads it throughout the book. At one point, the book led into the letter by just saying the letter was sticking out of his pocket, so he decided to continue reading it, or something like that. And that had been mentioned for ages, so it was a bit jarring that suddenly we're noticing the letter sticking out of his pocket. It was a bit weird. And a couple of times, like, something dramatic would happen, like an action scene would suddenly start, and it was so sort of sudden that it took me a while to understand what had just happened. But I think that comes from Pulley's blasé approach to the violence and the death, which overall worked, so that probably just more of a me problem. Not expecting it and getting a bit... I'm easily confused. They're very small things. I wouldn't really pay much attention to them. All in all, this is a great book, and I would highly recommend it. I would also recommend her as an author in general, to be honest, because she's a really good writer. This is actually her fourth book. She's also written The Watchmaker of Filigree Street and Bedlam Stacks, and this one, The Lost Future of Pepper Harrow, which I've just started reading. I won't review this one because it's actually a direct sequel to The Watchmaker or Filigree Street, and it'd be weird to review a sequel. So yeah, she's a really good writer, and I would just recommend all her books in general because they're really good. Just don't go into it expecting like proper science fiction, because it's not science fiction, it's historical with speculative elements. But if you're into that sort of thing, then have fun. And that's all I have to say. See you next time. Goodbye.